Professor Sylvia,
Yeah.
shall we start now? It is 6:30 now. So any formal welcome to, I think director will give.
Good morning, everyone all over the world. This is also an honor for me to start the session and to be the chair for a long 2 hours. But first of all, after welcoming you all, let me give the floor to the director of the Center for Research on North America, Professor Graciela Martinez Salce. We know that this is a joint effort between UNAM, the Center for Research on North America, and the Global Research Forum on Diaspora and Transnationalism. So, Dr. Martinez Salce, please, you have the floor. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you, Sylvia. As Sylvia said, my name is Graciela Martinez Salce, and I am the director of the Center for Research on North America from the National Autonomous University of Mexico. I would like to welcome you to this joint session organized by the Global Forum on Diasporas and Transnationalism, NCSAN. This is session number 16 of the panel and the second session with participation of CSAN. We have very special guests today, and I am sure this will be quite an interesting opportunity to compare the impact of United States migration policies for Indians and Mexicans. Our speakers are based in 4 countries: India, Mexico, the United States, and Spain. I would like to welcome our panelists, Monica Berea, Cyrus Mehta, Vinod Kradria, Tony Payan, Elizabeth Salamanca, and Antonio Alejo. I also send my special thanks to all the important scholars and diplomats who are joining us today. We will be happy to receive feedback from the public in the chat box, and we will try to respond accordingly. Your comments are very important and will be considered for a series of policy briefs edited by GRFDT and CSAN. Our moderator today is Silvia Núñez, who is a researcher and former director of the Center for Research on North America. Silvia Núñez is currently a member of the Executive Board and Treasurer of the United States-Mexico Commission for Educational and Cultural Exchange, COMEXUS, a member of the Executive Council of the Metropolis International Network, and of the Advisory Board of the Mexico Institute of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in the United States. I now pass the floor to Silvia so that we may start what I think will be a very fruitful session. Have a good day.
Thank you very much, Graciela. I am very honored for having this opportunity. As the director of CSAN mentioned, we are having 6 very distinguished panelists. I will begin by giving the floor to them, but just let me mention a brief paragraph regarding the very important topic we are going to address today. We know that we are living gloomy times in terms of human mobility all over the world. And there has been quite interesting publications in the last couple of weeks. One from IOM yesterday, and 10 days ago, The Economist launched an amazing publication on human mobility. We need to recognize that we are facing global challenges, especially because, as the Pew Research Center found out, 90% of the world's population lived in countries with coronavirus restrictions on foreign arrivals, which is the case precisely of the United States. We have also witnessed the proliferation of autocratic leaders in many countries, having Donald Trump as, we should call it, as a rock star for imposing restrictive policies against migrants and refugees, even before COVID-19 appear on the horizon. We all have known, and especially in Mexico, what his wonderful wall is all about, and how does he uses it as a symbol of power. There are also interesting issues, very terrible ones in America. For example, just to mention Title 8 enforcement actions and Title 42 expulsions that were enacted in March this year, precisely to empower CBP to prohibit the entry of certain persons who, for their opinion, would potentially pose a health risk to the United States coming from the borders of Mexico and Canada. So I believe this is going to be a challenging conversation. We have only less than 120 minutes. Each presenter, each speaker will have at the beginning 7 or 8 minutes to mention their initial remarks. And the initial question to pose to the floor is how do all of you see the policy framework that it's needed in this critical migration context in order to avoid the escalation of a securitization scheme. So with this in mind, I will start by giving the floor to Professor Cyrus Mehta. He has been a distinguished professor of law at Brooklyn School, where he teaches immigration and work. He's also the founder and managing partner of Cyrus D. Mehta PLLC. He has also been a former chairman of the board of trustees of the American Immigration Council, and he pursued his studies both in Cambridge University and in San Javier College in Bombay. Let me request you a special favor. I know that Professor Mehta is quite busy for today, so he will give his presentation and we will open the floor for all the VIPs, including the panelists, so that they can interact with Professor Mehta in order for him to leave if he doesn't have the opportunity to be with us for the rest of the session. So good morning, Professor Mehta. It is a big pleasure for me being the chair and giving you the floor.
Thank you so much. It's a great honor to be part of this forum, and I'm going to be presenting on the U.S. immigration policies under President Trump. You've already given an introduction on how Trump has become a rock star with regards to implementing restrictionist immigration policies. And I will provide more of a background so that we can then open up discussion on this. America has been a nation of immigrants. That's how it has always been known. Since Trump's election, he has changed the way the United States perceives immigrants. His administration views immigrants as generally hostile towards the interests of Americans. And he started off on that as part of his election platform, that you have Mexicans coming into the US. If people come in an undocumented capacity, they're criminals and rapists. That's how he started his election campaign. And then he also said that immigrants who come to the US and take up jobs are detrimental to the interests of Americans as part of his America First policy. Ever since Trump has come in, it's been pretty unfortunate for immigrants and for immigration advocates like us. The good news is that Trump does not represent most of the United States. As you know, he kind of became president through an electoral college victory. So he didn't get the majority of votes in the US. It's not like most US people are hostile towards immigrants, but his policies have demonstrated this hostility towards immigrants. When he took office, he used a provision, Section 212F of the Immigration and Nationality Act. And this is a pretty broad provision. It allows the president to bar any groups of foreign nationals if they're detrimental to the interests of the US. It was enacted sometime in 1952, and it has been used in a very kind of narrow way by other presidents. And it's basically been used as part of diplomacy to basically try to entice foreign countries to cooperate on certain policies or to retaliate against them. And it was used to retaliate against officials of certain countries. But what Trump did was he used 212F to totally reorder immigration law. And immigration law is passed by the US Congress under the separation of powers doctrine. And 212F gives the president leeway to ban foreign nationals if they are detrimental to the interests. And he used this very broadly to impose what we now know as the Muslim ban. And it banned at least 150 million or more from countries like Iran, Sudan, Libya, and other countries with mostly Muslim populations. And so this was his first experiment with using 212F to impose a wholesale and broad ban on immigrants that were disfavored by his administration. Unfortunately, 2 years later, the Supreme Court in Trump versus Hawaii upheld that ban on the grounds that 212F gives broad power to the president, and the courts have to defer to the president's judgment with regards to foreign policy. Now, he has then continued, after he got this victory, to use this 212F to impose other bans that had more of a domestic flavor. So for example, in 2018, he implemented a ban for people who were coming into the US who didn't have health insurance. Now, this was purely domestic. It had nothing to do with retaliating against countries that were not cooperating. This was purely a domestic issue. And so this was challenged in the courts, and the Ninth Circuit, it's not yet gone to the Supreme Court, but at least the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals said that the president can't use 212F to reorder immigration law. There's already a statute that Congress has enacted that contradicts the president's proclamation with regards to health insurance. It violates the separation of powers doctrine. So there have been some kind of, victories with regards to Trump's use of his broad power under Section 212F. But then in 2020, we then had the coronavirus that just, crept on us and has caught everybody by surprise. But sure enough, Trump has weaponized the coronavirus to continue his restrictionist policies on immigration. And he has imposed one ban and another on different countries. He imposed a ban on the whole Schengen region. He imposed a ban on China, a ban on Brazil. And so those were still kind of limited and they were based on COVID. But then in April, he imposed a ban on mostly all green card processing at overseas consulates. So these are people who waited to come in as green card holders, as legitimate immigrants. And now most of them have been banned. There are exceptions, spouses of US citizens, minor children, but generally speaking, people who were legally waiting in the line to come in as legal immigrants, including parents of American citizens, have now been banned under that proclamation. And then in June, Trump issued another proclamation on non-immigrant visas. These are vital work visas, like the H-1 visa, the L intra-company transferee visa. And he imposed a ban on that under the ground that American workers have to be protected because of the high unemployment rate as a result of the COVID-19 infection. So this is where we stand. And yeah, and then he has also kind of used COVID to, lock down on asylum processes. So for example, there's now a proposed rule saying that if an asylum seeker has crossed or come from countries that are hotspots, and it's not just COVID, but any kind of, infectious diseases, then you can also kind of deny the ability of that person to apply for asylum in the United States. And now just imagine the US has been the beacon of hope and liberty to the world's persecuted since its inception. The Statue of Liberty outside New York Harbor, and my office is just there. I can see the Statue of Liberty when I come out of my building. It represents this whole beautiful notion of welcoming people who have been persecuted. But Trump has just changed this completely around and used COVID as a basis to get away with it for the time being. Now, the topic of this panel is how does this impact migration from Mexico and India? I can speak briefly about India first, and then I'll also give my thoughts on Mexico. So with respect to India, the H-1B visa is used widely in India. Most people who use the H-1 visa are Indian nationals. They're skilled workers, they're professionals, and they're in the pipeline for the green card. And they've been caught in huge backlogs because of a defect in the way the supply of visas are distributed every year. And as a result of which, Indians are in decades-long backlogs. And they have to survive in the US on the H-1B visa. And now Trump has imposed a ban on H-1B visa holders who were outside the United States at the time of the ban. So a lot of people have been impacted as a result. Family members, Indians sponsor their parents. They are US citizens. They want to sponsor parents and brothers and sisters. They have also been impacted. With regards to Mexico, same thing. These bans impact Mexicans, but there are other issues with Mexico. When people try to cross into the US through Mexico and apply for asylum, they've been impacted terribly. And so where do we stand now? We are at this interesting juncture where the elections are going to be held in November. And the question is, what's going to happen? Of course, if Trump gets defeated, the good thing is that these are all executive actions. Congress has not passed any law. And that's the whole reason why Trump was able to get away. He couldn't do these things in Congress, and he uses executive authority broadly under Section 212F to impose these bans under the guise of protecting America's national security, and now more recently, protecting American jobs under COVID. And basically, that's where we are at. And if Trump loses, then it will all get changed. So I think I'm going to stop here at this point of time and allow my co-panelists to speak or open it up for discussion.
Thank you so much. It is so interesting that you have already mentioned the case of Mexico in a comparative perspective with the rest, but particularly with the case of India, which is exactly the focus of today's conversation. So the floor is open to the rest of the panelists. If someone would like to jump in, please.
Okay, I take the word. So
welcome,
thank you,
Elizabeth.
Thanks. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel on migration after COVID-19. I'm very glad to share this panel with my colleagues and with all the people who are joining us today. I'm going to concentrate my intervention on a segment of migration that has been increasing here in Mexico during the last 15 years. I mean, the migration from Mexico to the United States, that is a skill and high skill migration. And it has increased not just in terms of its volume, but also in terms of its relevance due to its contribution to the US economy. And as Dr. Cyrus Mira has already mentioned, there has been a significant impact in terms of the issuance of some specific kind of visa, such as the H-1B that he already mentioned. But before concentrating on skill and high skill migration, I just want to make some remarks about what is happening right now with the COVID-19 pandemic. And I want to say that the impact of the pandemic will only be clear in its entirety in months, if not years to come. Certainly, it will be those in low-income jobs in the low-skill service sector and those with a low level of qualifications, educational qualifications, that will suffer the most from the consequences of this pandemic. But we have also to recognize that skill and high skill migration are also being affected by all these new measures and policies that the Trump administration has been taking during the last months because of the pandemic, or at least they say that these measures are a consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. Throughout history, we know that migration has always been a very controversial policy and social topic, but it is true that when we face times of fear, times of insecurity, it is a topic that becomes even more controversial. And unfortunately, emergencies sometimes justify policy measures that will normally seem too harsh or rushed in normal times.
Excuse me. Do you have a specific question to ask to Professor Mehta, because he needs to leave the session, and we will go back to the rest of the speakers, please. Elizabeth, wrap up.
I think some problem is there in the audio. Is it over, Dr. Elizabeth?
Okay, I think I do not have any problem with my audio. I was just waiting for the rest of the audience if they have specific questions for Dr. Cyrus Mehta.
I do have a question, a quick question to Professor Mehta. Considering that America is just about to face an election, which I consider this is a historical one, what do you foresee in terms of what would happen if Biden wins regarding the disimplementation of all these measures that have been imposed by Donald Trump? That this cannot be done automatically, especially because we will be still facing the challenges of COVID-19.
Yeah, this is a good question, but as I said in my concluding remarks, that all these are executive actions. They are not laws passed by Congress. So they would be very easy to undo by the next president. So for example, if Biden becomes president, he has actually vowed to revoke all these executive actions. Now, you do raise a good point that if the COVID pandemic continues to rage and the American people, feel threatened that immigrants are taking their jobs, even a more immigrant-friendly administration, such as Biden's, might not, reverse everything right away. So I don't think it's just going to be euphoria and on day one everything will be rescinded. But at least now, in terms of the promises that are made and the way Biden is running his election campaign, it looks pretty optimistic that many of these, the most awful draconian executive actions, these travel bans, will hopefully get rescinded. There are other restrictions that have been passed through administrative rules. Even those are easier to undo than congressional acts. Unfortunately, there aren't too many congressional laws. So I think that's my response. And I'd be happy to take other questions. And I'm sorry if Professor Salamanca was interrupted here. All I would like to interject. Yes, is that I agree that from Mexico too, there's a lot of high-skilled immigration, and the relationship that Mexico has with the U.S. is also based on what was known as the North America Free Trade Agreement, which Trump has changed to the U.S., Mexico, and Canada agreement. And there are visas that emanate from that agreement too. So Mexicans can come in on the TN visa and they come in as professionals. So there is a lot of, interesting high-skilled immigration. Unfortunately, Trump's proclamations have not impacted that Mexican TN visa. And, Elizabeth, you might want to kind of talk more about that, but I didn't want to interrupt you. And I'm sorry if you got interrupted, but if there are any further questions, I'll be happy to answer them at this point.
I have a question for you, Dr. Mehta. What's your general perception about Trump policies and measures regarding the family reunification visas as compared to these skill and high skill non-immigrant and immigrant applications? Do you consider that in general the Trump administration is more focused on avoiding family reunification than skill migration, or do you consider that the kind of measures that his administration is taking are pretty similar in that sense?
Okay, just let me jump in. The time is running so quickly, and I would like Professor Mehta to answer this question, and then I need to give the floor to the rest. We still have
Sure.
5 panelists, and hopefully
Absolutely.
Professor Mehta will be able to be with us a longer time in order for we open the floor once the 5th others will have already presented their points of view. Okay, please, Professor
Okay,
Mehta.
so I just want to kind of make clear that I'm not a PhD, I'm not a doctor, I'm a practicing lawyer. So don't call me Dr. Mehta. I don't have a PhD. I'm not in such distinguished company as my panelists. I am a adjunct professor at Brooklyn Law School, but I'm a practicing lawyer, and my bread and butter is practicing law. And then of course I also have academic interests. But to answer your questions, Elizabeth, we thought that Trump was against undocumented immigrants and family immigration, and which he pejoratively referred to as chain migration, because you sponsor one family member, then that family member becomes a citizen and then sponsors others, although it takes decades for this chain to really work. And by the way, even Trump's family has practiced chain migration through his wife, who then sponsored her parents. So we thought that was where Trump's focus was, but it seems like he's also attacked skilled immigration, family immigration. There seems to be a general hostility. He's got in his administration a senior policy advisor, Stephen Miller, who is very influential. Stephen Miller is a xenophobe, and he came from xenophobic roots. He was with think tanks that opposed immigration policy, and these people have been given more credibility and respectability under the Trump administration when they were formerly pariahs. in other administrations, even in Republican administrations prior to this. So unfortunately, I think there is this general hostility, and Trump, in order to win, and he wants to win at any cost, wants to play to his base, this narrow base in these Midwestern states. He wants to get that electoral college advantage again. And when he does something harsh on immigration, then it kind of, riles up his base. He feels that he becomes more popular among his base. And so whenever he's down or there's some scandal or whatever, he tries to kind of, do something pretty draconian with immigration. And all this is kind of pretty sad. I'm talking about it with a straight face, but it's sad, and I really hope we can kind of get out of this nightmare. But if not, then there are millions of immigrants in the United States that still need to be protected, and we will have to play defense. And fortunately, we will continue to sue Trump in the courts of law, and hopefully, the courts will uphold the law, and that's our vision if Trump wins. But if Trump does not, then we have a more optimistic outlook on immigration.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Mehta. It's been an interesting and quite informative presentation. You have the combination of being an activist, an advocate, and also you have your teaching duties. So congratulations. Next, in the floor, our next speaker will be Professor Mónica Berea. I'm so honored and so excited about introducing her. She is our rock star at UNAM in terms of migration studies. In fact, she has been the founder director of the Center for Research on North America. She's a passionate scholar on migration issues. She's both a sociologist and international relations expert, and she has written many articles and books on migration, return migration, migrants and in economic crisis. And she has also been participating with us in 2 or 3 international metropolis conferences. So please, Mónica Berea, as our VIP this morning from Mexico, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. I am very glad to participate in this important seminar. I also am glad that I am after Cyrus Mehta, who gave an excellent introduction, so I can follow into my presentation, which is about Trump's asylum ban. During the almost 4 years as president, Donald Trump has drastically hardened the U.S. immigration policy through the establishment of multiple executive orders and federal regulations. His main objective has been to toughen the U.S. migration policy through the acceleration of apprehensions and deportations, restrict the admission of immigrants and temporary workers, substantially reduce the admission of refugees, and deny asylum to the growing flows that have arrived at this border during this period. Simultaneously, during the period of time, caravans of whole families, a new form of collective organization of migration, crossed Mexican territory towards Mexico-US border, coming from the northern triangle countries of Central America, mainly Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. They are running away mainly from extreme poverty, climate change, and by the growing criminal violence, with the purpose to ask for asylum or to cross irregularly to the US-Mexico border. It is important to mention that there has always been a traditional flow of Central Americans crossing Mexican territory towards the United States, but it has increased significantly during last years. So Mexico is a country of migrant destiny, transit, and of immigration, having the major diaspora in the United States of about 36.6 million of Mexican origin population, and 11.2 million is the Mexican foreign born population by 2018. The approach of the caravan from Central America intensified Trump's anger, accusing the Mexican government of doing nothing to stop the flows, constantly threatening to withdraw from NAFTA if Mexico did not respond. In response to the coming of the caravan in March 2018, Trump established a zero-tolerance policy and started separating parents from their daughters and from their children when they attempted to cross the border illegally into the United States. Fortunately, amid the national and international outcry demanding that families remain together, 3 months after Trump was forced to sign an executive order reversing his highly controversial policy. Trump has also pressed Mexican governments to accept the Safe Third Country Agreement, which have been denied constantly. Very recently, Trump got a Safe Third Country Agreement with Guatemala, which would require asylum seekers passing through Guatemala to the US to apply for asylum there. It has been interpreted as a violation of US refugee protection laws due that Guatemala cannot qualify as a safe third country as it lacks infrastructure to assist large numbers of refugees. With El Salvador and Honduras governments, he established similar agreements but has not been implemented yet. Advocates are now challenging these agreements in US courts, but meanwhile, Trump has strategically moved to the US border further south in order to dismantle the US asylum system. On the other hand, Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO or López from now on, since the beginning of his administration in December 2018, took a different approach and began to assist Central American migrants crossing through Mexican territory on their humanitarian policy. AMLO offered these migrants shelter and renewable visa, which allowed them to work. This situation was interpreted even by migrants coming from long distances as from Africa and Asia as an invitation to cross our territory to the US flows that increased significantly. On the other hand, AMLO accepted at the beginning of his administration de facto Trump's remain in Mexico policy without a formal bilateral agreement. The objective is to return non-Mexican undocumented migrants or asylum seekers to Mexican territory for an indefinite amount of time while their claims are processed. This constitutes a violation of the principle of non-refoulement, which prevents countries from returning migrants to territories where they might be subject to persecution, torture, or even death. This is the case of some Mexican border cities. Since then, we have provided the US with detention centers in different northern border cities where asylum seekers could be held indefinitely. AMLO passive response, accepting everything, was interpreted as a part of a non-confrontational policy towards Trump, probably seeking to promote the signing of the USMCA, which was approved in July, or to diminish Trump's anti-Mexican attitude policy during almost all his term, and also the eventual confirmation of what AMLO has called a Marshall Plan for Central America. In April 2019, President Trump gave the Mexican government a one-year warning before closing the southern border and threatened to impose trade tariffs in Mexico if it did not put a halt to all illegal immigration. This caused AMLO to shift his government humanitarian strategy, a reversal of his initial open door policy. Unsatisfied with his shift in AMLO's approach, Trump announced in May 2019 that he would implement a 5% tariff on imports from Mexico, stating that the tariff will gradually increase until the illegal immigration problem is fixed. In an extremely rushed response, AMLO formally accepted the remain in Mexico formally and signed a bilateral migration collaboration agreement in June 2019. López started implementing an enforcement policy, a change of strategy, and by June were detained 4 times more immigrants than in January 2019. Also, it was reflected in the downturn of US apprehensions since the same month, that shows that the huge pressure imposed by Trump to López did work for them. AMLO did not warn his counterparts that Mexico's institutions could not possibly stop all migrant flows because we do not have neither the staff nor infrastructure nor the economic means to afford it. This agreement has given Trump shelters in different cities for their asylum seekers. As of March 2020, nearly 65,000 people had been put into MPP. In order to fully cooperate with the persecution and deportation of migrants in a very pleasing way, Lopez has responded to Trump's pressure by deploying around 25,000 brand new and experienced National Guard troops to our southern and northern borders and the interior. They have served as border patrols with little or no training to carry out migratory operations and prevent the transit of Mexicans and Central America's migrants to United States territory, a highly controversial policy and an unprecedented one in the history of migratory bilateral relations. The new AMLO's enforcement policy has given Trump sufficient arguments to pronounce, such as, I quote, "I am using Mexico to protect our border. I want to thank Mexico for the 25,000 soldiers." And he is right. Trump managed to get the Mexican government to pay for the controversial wall equivalent to the deployment of National Guards to apprehend and deport them to their country of origin, with shelters in deplorable conditions where thousands of Central Americans await a resolution, months or even years by immigration judges. Finally, this situation has got much worse with COVID-19, which I will mention afterwards. I will elaborate more afterwards. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Monica. It is so good that you are highlighting the situation, particularly of the Andrés Manuel López Obrador situation, because this was absolutely necessary to incorporate in this debate in order for our colleagues from all over the world to try to understand the particular situation that Mexico is going through. So I am so happy and also so proud and honored to be hosting Professor Vinod Kadria. He is a great friend of mine, but I consider him my mentor. He has taught economics, education, and migration at Jawaharlal Nehru University for more than 3 decades. He's a committed scholar. He has a lot of students that considers him a rock star in real time. And this is the reason why he was awarded the ICCR Chair of Contemporary Indian Studies at Rutgers University. And he's been working a lot with the United States, with the IOM, in terms of being one of the most important collaborators in the publishing of the World Migration Report to 2020. And also his most recent publication was being the co-editor of a Sage Handbook of International Migration in the year 2019. Welcome, Vinod. And I'm so happy to see you. I get so emotional whenever I see you so far.
Thank you for the extraordinary praise showered on me, which makes it more difficult for me to do justice to this panel here. But it is very inspiring to listen to the initial presentations. And I'm glad Professor Mehta has mentioned about Statue of Liberty and taken us back in history. And if I am to address the topic of the day, which is lessons from India and Mexico, of course, I'll speak about India, then the lessons go back to 500 years ago, because that is when America was discovered by Christopher Columbus, made a mistake, thought it was India, and the natives were started to be called Native Indians or Red Indians later on by the British, which are not any more respectable terms to be used. But we are aware of the fact that the nation of immigrants, the term that has been used, is actually particular immigrants. They are not for the entire world. They are for the Europeans, because who displaced the Africans, who annihilated the Native Americans. So we need to look into the details of history if we need to draw lessons from history. I would like to evoke that the history is not only with bad examples, it has also very good examples. And that is where I'm reminded, I'm inspired to read out Emma Lazarus's that sonnet, which is placed on a plaque in the Statue of Liberty. And it allow me a minute to say, keep ancient lands, you storied pomp, and you know who the pomp is now. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. The golden door still remains golden for Indians. As Mehta had said, the H-1B visa holders are all highly skilled people, but United States was not welcoming the unskilled people to begin with. In 1917, the Congress was debating what is called the literacy bill, literacy test bill, and that was opposed, that was vetoed by Woodrow Wilson, who otherwise is known to have racist tendencies. He himself vetoed this 3 times, but the US Congress passed it to stop Indians, Chinese, Fijians, and people of Asiatic origin who were not literate in the English language. That came to my mind, that was a challenge. And ironically, within 50 years, the Indians, the Chinese that went to the United States were at the top of the line, the model minority. They were the highly educated, the best educated, the highest income earners, and they were the model minority. If we look at the census, US Census, we get a feel of that. We do not have time. I have only 7 to 8 minutes, so I have to be very brief. And I would say that history also has very good examples, like Abraham Lincoln abolished slavery in 1850 because the slaves were brought as immigrants from they were already there, but they were enslaved in the United States, and so on. So I would like to say that by the middle of the century, by the Indian IIT professionals, IIT graduates who were, under the India's 5-year plans of development, where these 5 IITs were set up, they brought out these graduates onto the market, but there were no jobs for them. They became unemployed. And that is when the United States attracted them to NASA to help them in their space research and in their competition against the Russian Sputnik mission. That, I think, has even now today, why there is so much of rush for getting admission into the IITs. That is because that is the golden gate. That is the passport to United States of America. So in that background, if you look at these issues, then we have seen ups and downs in H-1B visas, in other kinds of visas. In fact, Barack Obama, for example, introduced H-4 visa, which was to give work authorization to the spouses of H-1B visa holders that Trump is trying to undo now. And those are some of the lessons, because I'm trying to focus on the lessons. And I have said it many times that we do talk about good practice guidelines, but we have to also talk about bad practice guidelines. And this is what we are experiencing now, the bad practices. And those bad practices are already there, which can be phased out, hopefully, when the regime changes, when the new election takes place. Perhaps we need to identify, talk about the bad practices and try to phase them out. Good practices are not there forever. Good practices do not fall from the heaven as manna from the heaven. So we need to focus on both of them and invent good practices if they do not exist already. So if we look at India, then 1952 Act is mentioned there. Until then, there were only 100 people from India in the United States because it was connected with the ratio of the population already in the United States. It was 1965 Act, Immigration and Nationality Act, that abolished the quota, that brought Indians at par with all other countries. And that is when the unemployed IIT graduates could immediately go to NASA and to fill up. And subsequently, by the end of the century, to cut a long story short, it was the IT professionals, the IT revolution, which flooded the Silicon Valley and the entire technological revolution that took place in the United States was on the shoulders of the Indian techies. That cannot be forgotten. And what happened at that time? Recession struck 1992, and then subsequently Y2K fear actually drove these Indians to give up Indian nationality, Indian citizenship, and they naturalized themselves into the American citizenship, because India does not allow dual citizenship. That was one of the peak of the naturalization rate. And subsequently, when India enacted what is called the OCI, Overseas Citizenship of India, which was almost like a dual citizenship, excepting that you cannot stand in elections, Indian elections, you cannot buy plantation lands, but short of that, you have every other right that a citizen can have. That was 2006, when this was done for roping in the diaspora to bring in investment in India. But I had predicted at that time that it would boomerang, it would not give the desired results, it would rather drive them off to give up Indian citizenship, take the OCI and become American citizens, and at the same time enjoy all the rights under OCI in India. And exactly that happened. That was a peak in 2008. So it's entirely, if we have to draw the lessons, we have to draw the lessons from both sides. It's back and forth. It's an interrelationship between two countries that we need to look into. So I would like to say, as Professor Mehta has mentioned, immigration policy making itself has been a democratic process in the Congress, but there have been times like this, the present times, when the executive order overrides. You have Article 212F, which actually comes handy to dictators for putting in place what they want to in terms of violating the democratic rights of the people, not only of one country, but of many countries. So this is where we see that there are issues, there are lessons that we can draw. If we look at various issues, there are professionals, of course, H-1B, there are naturalized American Indian citizens, there are green card holders, the LPR, the permanent residents, and then there are temporary residents like H-1B, and then there are students, a large number of students. India, China, these are at the top, Mexico, Vietnam. These are the countries, Korea, these are the countries which are sending the largest number of students, that supports the American universities and makes education, overseas education, the 5th largest export earning industry in the United States. That is being threatened. Even that is being threatened. And why White House backtracked? Because there was threatening by MIT, by Harvard, to come with lawsuits, and techie giants like Google and Amazon also threatened. That was for the first time that the F-1B visa ban was withdrawn. But what followed? What followed was that the industry cannot fire American citizens. It can fire Indian citizens holding jobs, but American citizens cannot fire. So we do not know in the pipeline what new inventions and innovations are likely to come, and how they are going to challenge us, what lessons they will give us for posterity. That, I think, is very, very important. We need to refer to Silicon Valley, because we do have Silicon Valley of India in Bangalore, which also is having Infosys, Wipro. These are technical giants in India. They are being bleeded by the visa fee rise of the H-1B. It is more than $6,000 now for Indian companies. If they are American companies, they don't have to. There is a discriminatory pricing for H-1B visas. So we have to learn those lessons. That I think is very, very important. And to come back, what is important, the lesson that is important is that there is a great degree of selectivity. Diversity is passé. Nobody talks about diversity anymore. It is a great deal of selectivity, that you choose the best and the brightest, not the huddled masses, but the best and the brightest. That need to come, and that is what policies are driving us to. Not only the American policies, all destination countries, mostly. It's a question of degree, not of the kind. That, I think, and I would put a question mark whether India is also going the same way. That, I think, is a question mark that we need to reflect upon. So I would like to end by saying that where is the future where is the future where we can use these lessons? What use are these lessons if we cannot use them? Because we talk about multilateral negotiations, but immigration has always been a hot potato, which is not on the table of the multilateral negotiations. No country wants to give up sovereignty. In the name of sovereignty, it is not put on the table. For the first time, GCM has been a success story. For that, Kofi Annan started 16 years back in 2002, and it took 16 years for people to come back to the table. But the day it was to be signed, Trump withdrew, and then Hungary withdrew, and then Australia threatened, and now not all the countries are signatories of GCM, which is not binding on the countries. That I think is important. So we have to understand that world is not a level playing field. Multilateralism is not a level playing field. There are negotiations within negotiations, and that is why we have to call the shots and say enough of multilateralism. We at the best can have bilateralism. If that does not work, we have to have unilateralism, and that is what our national poet Rabindranath Tagore had written in Bangla, in Bengali language, Ekla cholo re. If nobody responds to your call, walk alone, walk alone, walk alone. Thank
Professor
you.
Kaja. Okay. Can you wrap up, Iseda? Can we
Yeah,
wrap up?
I have
Thank you
finished.
so much. Thank you very much. It is so relevant that you have highlighted the virtues of history, and they should organize another fora in order to discuss who has the right to define who are the best and the brightest, which is quite a controversial issue to address when we are talking about migration. The fourth speaker of this evening is Professor Tony Payan from Rice University. Professor Payan is the François and Edouard Didienan Fellow for Mexico Studies, and he is the current director from the Center for the United States and Mexico at the Baker Institute in this prestigious university in Houston, Texas. Professor Payan has also been the president of the Association of Borderland Studies between the years 2009 and 2010. And his research focuses primarily on border studies, particularly in the US-Mexico border. Welcome, Tony. It's a pleasure having you with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. And I want to acknowledge my colleague and friend, Elizabeth Salamanca, and of course, Camelia Tigao, who spent some time with us at the Baker Institute in Houston. So I'll try to keep to my time. Let me just say that I very much appreciated the remarks by Mr. Mehta, because indeed, I think we have to consider that Mr. Trump has not fundamentally changed US law. He has interpreted and reinterpreted US law, and the changes that we are looking at in the United States are through EOs or executive orders. And they're reversible. And so we are waiting for the November elections to see what happens, what's going to happen to these executive orders. I think there is a high possibility that some of them, at least the harshest of them, will be reversed by a potential Biden president, but not necessarily. I think what we are looking at in the United States is essentially a change in mood. So an important question to contemplate here is whether we are looking at a fundamental change in attitudes towards immigration in the United States or not. And that depends on a number of things that are going on. And that has to do with the COVID-19 crisis and the fact that there are 30 million unemployed individuals in the United States. And the priority for the jobs available in the United States are going to be for these 30 million citizens of the United States and residents of the United States, legal permanent residents in the United States who are unemployed. And so I wouldn't trust that Biden would immediately reverse some of these most stringent EOs. That has been Trump's idea, that to change the flow of immigration in order to prioritize the economic citizenship of U.S. citizens and permanent residents as well. And I think that will be a priority for Biden himself, and that the recovery in the United States is going to be quite difficult, and that's going to take a while. So they're probably going to think along different lines, but similar to Trump's in terms of prioritizing U.S. citizens, and we have to think about that. The other thing is, will there be comprehensive immigration reform? I think there is an opportunity for comprehensive immigration reform under a potential Biden presidency after November. We'll see what happens. Things are not assured, but that will depend on two other things. And we have written about this particular issue. One is border security. And the reality is that the United States has on purpose not defined border security. There isn't a definition. There isn't a marker. There are no benchmarks for border security. This is a moving goalpost. And as long as the federal administration does not define what border security means, it's never going to be achieved, even though the numbers are moving in the right direction. So my guess is that the United States has refused, both political parties refused to define border security, precisely because it gives them much more room for maneuver in restricting immigration, asylum seekers, and so on. So there's an intention behind the vague definition of border security. And the other thing is what to do with the 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. If we do not resolve those two major roadblocks, there's not going to be a major immigration reform. We've seen it before. We've seen the attempt to do that in the past. The other thing, I think in the case of Mexico, there was a missed opportunity. Mexico was reacting to the renegotiation of NAFTA, which which resulted in the USMCA replacing NAFTA on July 1st, just a little over a month ago. Mexico should have included a labor liberalization chapter. But Mexico is always reacting. Mexico has not been proactive in trying to establish its interests in the United States. Even when you examine the positions of the 50 consulates in the United States, 50 consulates or so in the United States is mostly a defensive position, is trying to defend immigrants. And so Mexico has not been very aggressive on that. And I think it was a missed opportunity to try to include an expansion of the TN visas. Or a system of visas for North America. I think that was a wasted opportunity on the López Obrador administration. I don't think that the United States will become a haven for immigration in the near future, even under a Biden administration, as I mentioned, not only because of the 30 million undocumented, but also because there is something else going on in the United States, and that is an undercurrent of anxiety among the United States population, especially the European descendant population, that the makeup of the United States is changing quite a bit. And Trump has obviously been able to use these fears much to his political advantage. If you look at the demographic changes in the United States, for example, you realize very quickly that the European descendant population is now well under replacement. For example, in Texas, I'm at this moment, I'm in Ciudad Juárez, in my house in Ciudad Juárez, but I'll be returning to Houston in a couple of weeks. But if you look at Texas, last year in 2018, Texas added 9 Hispanic residents for every Anglo resident that Texas gained that year. So the gains by minorities in the United States, almost 20% Hispanics now, 13-14% African Americans, and Asians are actually growing faster than Hispanics and African Americans at this point, is such that it's creating a lot of anxiety in the European or the white population of the United States. And I think that the fertility rates also show that European descendant population are at a fertility rate of 1.6. The required replacement level is 2.1. Hispanics are also dropping quite fast at a 2.3, 2.4. Currently, African Americans are about 2.1, and Asians are the fastest growing group. And by Asians, we mean Indians, Chinese, Taiwanese, so Asians, Filipinos. So it's difficult to speak of Asians as a single group per se, because they're so varied. It's such a vast continent. So there's a lot of anxiety in this country, and how will that anxiety on the changing face of America be resolved in law if there is an attempt at comprehensive immigration law in the comprehensive immigration reform in the future? I'm not sure. But I don't think it's going to resolve itself necessarily in the direction of greater openness of the US immigration system. With that, I conclude my 7 minutes. I don't think the United States is going to be in the future the kind of immigration nation that we expect it to be. Countries like India and Mexico and many others must now shift their policy to development, internal development, to provide for the opportunities for their own population. I think the immigration system in the United States is closing. It is a different closing than it was 60, 70 years ago. And it is definitely going to close over the mid part of the 21st century. So we must be prepared for that. The US is going to become much pickier about who comes in, and it's likely to change towards much higher skilled immigrants, very selectively chosen. So those are some of the remarks in 7 minutes. Thank you very much for the opportunity, Sylvia. And again, hello to Elizabeth Salamanca and of course, Camelia Tigao.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, especially because you were so strict with the timing, and I have now the honor to present Professor Elizabeth Salamanca. She's a researcher and professor at the Universidad de las Americas in Puebla, Mexico, in the School of Business and Economics. She got her PhD in economics in the prestigious University of Johannes Kepler University in Linz, Austria. She has been a scholar, a visiting scholar at the Baker Institute with Tony Payan, the same as Camelia. And she has a recent publication that it's titled Human Resources Strategies in the Restaurant Industry, Overcoming Institutional Voids in Latin America, Emerging Markets. So it's a good opportunity for us to listen what an economist has to say regarding all this issue of migration in the United States, India, and Mexico being the main actors in this conversation. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. And I apologize because previously I thought that the conversation was open to the rest of the panel members. So I'm going to try to take less time in order to recover the time that I took previously. I just want to comment that the administration of President Trump, as my colleagues have already mentioned, has dismantled and reconstructed many elements of a US immigration system that was last reformed in 1996. I will say that the US-Mexico border is more closed off than perhaps any time in US history. As Tony Payan mentioned before, legal immigration has experienced a historic contraction. But the arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic gave the Trump administration an opening, let's say, in the name of public health and concern for the growing economic crisis, to finish off many of the remaining items on its migration agenda, including suspending the issuance of visas to certain categories of immigrants and also of non-immigrants. As I said before, if I focus my intervention on skill and high skill migration, I must say that in overseeing the nation's non-immigrant visa programs, which allow foreign nationals to enter the United States temporarily for specific purposes such as education or work, The Trump administration has focused clearly on protecting the interests of US workers, as my colleague said before. This effort has centered around the president's April 2017 executive order that we all know very well, Buy American and Hire American. And consequently, the US Citizenship and Immigration Services and the Labor Department have increased the scrutiny with which new non-immigrant applications are processed, and they have intensified efforts to ensure that non-immigrants already inside the United States are adhering to the terms of their visas. For example, last June, as my colleague said before, the administration suspended several categories of non-immigrant visas until the end of this year. And we have clear examples such as the H-1B visas that we already mentioned for technology workers, but also the L-1 visas for corporate executives and the J-1 visas for scholars and exchange programs. I'm not going to go into details in terms of the changes that all these visas have gone through. We can talk about these details in the questions session. But what I want to emphasize is that these changes can be very detrimental to the US economy in the long run, as evidenced by a recent paper that was published by the Wharton School, which found that when America restricts for example, H-1B visas, multinationals do not hire more Americans. Rather, they shift operations to Canada, India, and China. In the case, for example, of foreign students, we all knew about the controversial measure of reducing flexibility for this fall semester 2020 in several ways. Most notably by not allowing non-immigrant students attending schools holding classes entirely online to be issued a visa or permitted to enter or remain in the United States. In response to a lawsuit filed by Harvard and the MIT challenging the policy, the Department of Homeland Security on July agreed to rescind it. But despite this reversion, new students may not enter the United States in fall 2020 if they have an online course load of more than one class or 3 credits. There's also a specific kind of visa that during the last decade has attracted the attention of foreign investors, which is the EB-5. The EB-5 program provides permanent residence to a foreign national who invests in a commercial project in the United States that creates at least 10 US jobs. But recently, the US Citizenship and Immigration Services updated the minimum amount of money an EB-5 visa applicant will have to invest from $1 million to $1.8 million for investments in most parts of the United States, and from $500,000 to $900,000 for investments in the so-called targeted employment areas, or TEAs, that are areas that have a high level of unemployment or a lower level of development. So if we consider all these changes, what we can conclude is that under the Trump administration, case processing times have significantly increased for all application types, but especially for immigrants. For example, the processing time for employment-based green card applications more than doubled between 2016 and 2020, from 6.8 months to 14 months. So just to finish my participation, I will say that there is no clear timeline for when immigration restrictions put in place in the name of slowing the spread of the virus will be is. The November election may further reshape the already unsettled immigration landscape. Trump's re-election would likely be viewed by many as a reaffirmation of his immigration agenda. Should Democrats instead prevail in 2020, the new administration would likely seek, as Tony Payan mentioned before, undo many of the Trump actions on immigration. But while it may be possible to rescind many of these changes, others cannot simply be undone. Merely rescinding each of the hundreds of changes that the Trump administration has implemented will require a massive financial, personnel, and bureaucratic investment. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. We will turn the floor now to Professor Antonio Alejo. Welcome, Antonio. It's a pleasure having you with us. Professor Alejo collaborates with the research group Societies on the Move at the University of A Coruña, and he's an associate researcher with the Instituto Galego de Análisis y Documentación Internacional. His topics of interest are global political sociology, diplomatic transformations, and human mobility. He has published extensively in very prestigious institutions such as CEDAW and Latin American Policy. Welcome, Antonio, and the floor is yours. Let me just mention that after you give your remarks, I will open the floor to a long list of VIPs that they are all eager to jump into this conversation. So hopefully we will have time to wrap up this discussion, demanding a second round of all of you in this in another Zoom. So please, welcome.
Thank you. Do you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, I want to thank to GRFDT and CISAN, particularly Professor Martinez and Untitled, for this invitation. Today, I will focus in a very specific topic about deportation. But today, I will focus on the experience of the poor people with long-term ties in the United States and the process of resettlement in Mexico City. I have to read because I prepared a little paper, so sorry if it's very boring, but I have to read this paper. So I start. Following Goodman, the United States has deported nearly 75 million people since 1882, more than any other country in the world. And little attention has been paid to know what happens in the post-deportation lives. However, the experience of the poor people are starting to gain acknowledgement by scholars and are recognizing them as American diaspora. Are you hearing me well? Or it's a little problem? Are you hearing me well? Yeah. Yep.
It has some echo, but I don't know why.
Okay, thanks.
Perhaps you can put the video off, Antonio.
Probably,
maybe we can hear the
thanks.
video.
Yeah, I turn it off.
Okay.
Okay, so I thought, as I told you, however, the experience of the poor people are starting to gain acknowledgement by scholars and are recognizing them as American diaspora. Caldwell asks, what happens when people are rejected and expelled by the country they consider their home? How do people's identities is tied to a country that does not recognize them members? Let's see. The political environment that migrants face in North America is characterized by white nativism. I understand nativism as a mechanism to redraw the boundaries between them and us and justify the maintenance of privilege of a particular group. Nativism takes shape through a set of eclectic policies that redefine who is the real people of a determined political unit and who therefore must have more rights and power to decide the characteristics of the society in front of a group considered exogenous and unable to assimilate the essential characteristics of the original group. According to some scholars, the emergence of contemporary white nativism stemmed from the expansion of segregation among the native population from the recent economic crisis, the loss of confidence of the white nativists in the state, as well as the demographic transformation in the Western societies and its impact on the native population. It appears that nativism is not per se a constitutively anti-immigrant political position, but its construction is complex because it has a worldview that endowes a specific political community, the state. So the state must be defended according to a unique version of its history and a proud sense of belonging. Thus, under nativism, a nostalgic version of a nation and an attitude against the foreigner are combined, from which anti-immigrant positions arise as the consequences and not the causes of how people's coexistence is defined and organized. Within this white nativist environment, I highlight the actions that organized return migrants developed to defend their rights in Mexico City. With this objective, I focus on the organization called CEDES and the binational activists that they use to work with the poor people in Mexico. These organizations affirm that migrants face situations of discriminations, racism, and violations of human rights, as the resettlement processes in Mexico have not been friendly, and there is often a negative sociocultural environment for return and the poor people. In the interview with the organization gave evidence relating to how this hostile context operates in Mexico City. They highlight 5 points. The first point to highlight is that those who return to their places of origin and those who for the first time migrate from where they born or have grown up do not want to go to Mexico. The second point is that returned people or the poor people are not always welcome by their families, as they were money providers, and in their new situation, they can no longer contribute, so thus, they are not contributing, so thus ending up being rejected. The third point is that the returned people have lost their standard of living because they have long ways to restart their lives. The fourth point is that after an exhausted life, product of living in an irregular legal situation, the returned people have feelings of failure. The last point that the interviews mentioned is that these returned people suffer racist and xenophobic actions, and they face mockery, abuse, and bullying from the locals who treat them with distance and rejection. Due to this complex situation in Mexico, CEDES argues that the deported people require solidarity, comprehension, and empowerment. This organization requires government to take concrete actions to resolve the crisis experienced with human mobility, and to do this, the organization proposed national, regional, and even mutual alliances. With the poor people, the organization promotes interculturality as they work with them because culture, races, beliefs are shared, mixed, and linked. As I told you before, this idea is how to think this new American diaspora as Caldwell has presented. To identify these deportees as the new American diaspora, I go back to Caldwell's question. What happens when people are rejected and expelled to the country they consider their home? According to Caldwell, approximately 1/3 of the people deported to Mexico consider the United States their home. President Obama, in many speeches about the Dreamers, mentioned that they are Americans in every way except for their papers. For Caldwell, the poor people with long-term ties to the United States are functional Americans by socialization. Regarding the empirical basis for this paper, these deportees see their situation as a living exile. Following these arguments, they live Americans mean to challenge the traditional notion of what it means to be Americans and contest white hegemonic constructions of what it means to be American. Thus, the American diaspora compels to rethink about different ways of defining membership and even social citizenship in the United States, and highlight the contradictions of vanishing people who feel like they belong with territorial boundaries of the United States. For closing this presentation, in these papers identified the returned people have constructed dynamic and hybrid cultures for themselves as products of their life story defined by mobility. Hence, it is not accurate to identify the migrants moved linearly, namely, leaving one nation state and arriving in another. Returned people express that they will try to go back to the United States, particularly those who have American citizenship. For them, their lives on the move do not conclude with the resettlement in Mexico. With this in mind, organizations as CEDES promote and defend the other experiences and the abilities that migrants have acquired in their lives. For these organizations, the global and local institutions recognize those characteristics of migrants, the poor people will be able to identify opportunities to restart their lives with dignity. So thanks, that is my little presentation. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Alejo. Now I will open the floor to very important colleagues and scholars that are joining us in this conversation. Let me just try to add up to this brainstorming open dialogue. And the question is if the US will be able to lean forward with less labor migration, and is it really that America in itself, it is already ready not to be one of the hottest spots in terms of attracting migrants into their country. So I have recognized that Professor Whaley is with us, also Professor Estos and Professor Ambapande. I would like to hear Professor Whaley in order for her to participate in this conference.
Thank you, Sylvia, and lovely to hear from Vina, Monica, and other distinguished panelists. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be able to join the discussion. I wish we could have time to extend that to all the participants. I actually raised a few questions in the chat box. So I would like to ask our US-based panelists, in terms of this enthusiasm for the potential for Biden getting elected may be overblown, because even when both US House and the Senate become Democrats dominated, or at least Democrats majority, that does not guarantee the reversal of immigration policy, or the so-called comprehensive immigration policy. If we recall, during Obama's first 2 years, that was exactly the situation. And back then, there were much grassroots support for immigration reform as compared now in the middle of pandemic. So I actually agree with Tony's assessment, but I would just like to hear other panelists. What do you think? What do you predict? And more importantly, from a grassroots effort, what can we do as grassroots effort, academics, consultants, lawyers, and all that, to push the possible positive change? Otherwise, the current, I would just say number 45, because I refuse to say his name, his administration before COVID-19, he consistently got 40% of Americans. This is national survey of representative sample, not just voters. So that means his policy, the xenophobia policy, had almost 40% of Americans' support. So how can a Biden election, even with two Democratic Congress houses, can reverse right away or in the long run, and how a grassroots movement can possibly push that. My question for Binod, which I also put on the chat box, you are always the master thinker, and I really appreciate your historical lesson and geopolitics remarks. So my question for you, and by extension for our India-based participants and thinkers and leaders, are given the US is such a situation, do you think Indians would still want to go to US or come to US, because I am in the US, or do you think India would prefer go to more quote unquote immigrant welcoming friendly countries such as Canada in particular, but also other English speaking countries that do not have the draconian kind of policy as US does? In the interest of time, I'll stop. I'm looking forward to listen to others' comments as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Weili. We will wait to have all the questions from our distinguished guests. So second, I'm opening the floor to Professor Amba Pandey to raise her question, please.
Okay.
We can hear you now. It's okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to ask a question. I would rather make a small comment about it, and which was touched upon by many of the speakers actually. But to put it very straight, very often while talking about migration, immigration actually, we tend to talk so much about policies, but actually we also have to relate those policies to the local politics, and once that is there, then any kind of multilateralism doesn't work, So the immigrants take up the job, and the jobs are directly related to election votes. So every time there is an election, there is an immigration issue, and it is raised to garner more votes. So this government, that government, any government, they cannot ignore this popular perception against the immigrants, which is there popular in every country, especially in US now. As far as the how is the US going to close its door? Well, Indians or any other migrants will find their new destinations. It has been happening, and that will happen again. So the question is how much India is capable of refilling the the demand all over the world. If the Indian government or the Indians have the capacity to produce more doctors, more engineers, or more, so then they can fulfill the demands of any other country and within ourselves, within the country itself. So this is what I thought, and as far as highly skilled immigration is concerned, it will be going to be in demand. The question is how much India or Mexico can refill their quota. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pandey. I have also a question from Kritishnu Sanyal to everyone. This says that not only immigration policies, are all government doctrines more or less work in a continuum irrespective of the ruling parties in the center? And I wonder if Professor Estos would like to present a question or a comment to the panel. Okay, let us keep on. I give the floor now to our panelists. So it seems that Professor Cyrus Mehta has already left. So Monica Berea will be the first to give a comment. It needs to work as an answer to the questions but also a brief comment from you regarding what you have been thinking about this panel altogether in order to be wrapping up the session. Monica, please.
Thank you, Sylvia. Well, answering the question, Whaley, which is a pleasure to see you as Asamba Pande. Sorry. I would like to say that the anti-immigrant agenda, the anti-immigrant agenda established by Trump, unfortunately, will continue not as serious as it has been, but it is difficult to reverse this whole attitude that has been established by the white supremacists and by Republicans that have followed, unfortunately, Trump's ideas and the anti-immigrant agenda. I agree with Tony that given this economic situation downturn, it's going to be difficult to reestablish, for example, the comprehensive immigration reform, to give the undocumented the undocumented population legality. So I really am anxious to know, to imagine what's going to happen. Besides that, the economic downturn of Mexico is going to be very complicated because many Mexican migrants are starting to rise and to go to the United States because the economic situation in Mexico, not only by COVID, but by the López Obrador administration, is getting worse. We have seen that the Mexicans have been paying a high economic and political cost of the deployment of a third of our National Guards, highly needed for our deteriorated security all over the country in order to detain and deport migrants and asylum seekers, doing the job the US government should do. This important deployment guards has caused migrants to move to more dangerous routes where migrants are more vulnerable to attack by criminal groups. Trump has managed to force López to pay for the controversial wall with a virtual one equivalent to the deployment of National Guards and the establishment of shelters at a very high economic, political, and social cost. Having migrants stationed at our southern borders, desperate to cross through Mexican territory, plus asylum seekers who have been crossed Mexico's border, along with those that have been deported by the US government or are waiting to be granted asylum at the northern border, constitute a time bomb, especially in those specific regions which López seldom confronts. As economic conditions deteriorate in Mexico, as I mentioned, US authorities have apprehended more and more Mexicans than Central Americans lately during July, which aggravates even more the situation in our northern border. Central Americans do not want to stay in Mexico, they want to get to the promised land, be it as asylum seekers or irregular migrants. Nevertheless, the immediate unintended consequence of this situation has been a significant increase of asylum seekers that have decided to stay in Mexico. Between January 2018 to October 2019, 90,000 applicants have registered, which is a very important amount. The COVID-19 worldwide pandemic since March 2020 has impacted negatively Mexico. The López administration followed the instructions of the United Nations to evict shelters to avoid contagions, and in March 2020, Mexico deported 3,600 Central American migrants, regardless of whether they were waiting for their asylum request to the United States. At the same time, in order to reduce the spread of the virus, the Trump administration temporarily restricted non-essential travel across the border so far until now. This constant return of large numbers of migrants to the northern border of Mexico, all of them being situated in crowded shelters, without knowing if they are COVID infected could aggravate the contagion. Thus, AMLE's open door policy was radically transformed, adopting since then a closed door immigration policy to safeguard the non-confrontation policy in order to please Trump, a radical change of strategy with a very high cost for our citizens and our finances. And I will stop here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. Binod, please. The floor is yours again.
Can you please unmute?
So I have to start all over again.
Yes.
And I must say that Professor Wiley has flagged very important questions in terms of whether Indians, she means Indian students, would they choose to go to US even under the circumstances, or would prefer a more friendly country like Canada or other countries? I think it would be both. I mean, it's not one broad brush and we say all the students for all times to come will boycott United States and go to Canada or other countries. Those who are already in the pipeline, those who have paid the tuition and have put in their resources, they probably would be risk takers and would still like to go to United States. But if they are risk averse, then they would rather consider that to be a sunk cost and take a long-term view in terms of putting their eggs in other baskets. And similarly, those who are not yet, who have still not started, they might think of other alternatives. And Canada certainly is one option. It is close to United States, similar culture, similar, although it's a cold country. But I think that is where the option lies. But there are other options also. English-speaking Europe, including England, and then you have Australia, New Zealand, and on the other side. So I think students are considering other options. And United States being the most affected country by COVID now, parents are not going to take that risk that they will send their children to United States. They would choose a less risky country. As for the other question that Professor Wiley has also put on the chat box is how Global South can better capture the moment. Well, I think, as I said, multilateralism is a dead horse now. It is, we have been fooled by multilateralism for many, many years. So we have to evolve other ways. And I sometimes have been talking about equitable adversary analysis, whereby putting ourselves, one country, the South, putting itself into the shoes of the North countries and try to assess the situation, and as I call it, equitable, because it is not like, game theoretic of trying to outsmart each other. It is more with empathy rather than, taking advantage of the situation. It is, easier said than done, but I think if the beginning can be made, as I said while talking, that even a unilateral step can be an example which Mexico can set or India can set in one policy area, and then perhaps it would have a snowball effect of others joining. And that may be, asking for the moon, but even then it is something which is hopeful, rather as we are thinking that, Trump's day would be over and there will be new transition that would come. Other than that, I would think that the demand is going for high skill in terms of STEM professionals and STEM students. And those are going to be in short supply. And that's where I think some kind of, dual citizenship or even UN health-keeping force, like you have UN peacekeeping force rotating diaspora. Diaspora can play a big role in that. One can think out of the box in those directions. And I think Professor Amba Pandey also mentioned about it, that the local politics affects the what would be the outcome, whether policy would be implemented or not successfully. And that's where when she talks about the self, I think, you see, India, for example, has now decided to not rely on other countries so much, particularly China. It has, channelized its investment, and it's from China back to India, and have taken the motto of self-reliance. So that can also be applied to human resource, to human capital, that we can have more. If we have more industry, then we'll have more openings, more employment for the new graduates that will be coming out of the highly skilled institutions. I think I have addressed the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Binod. I'm going to read another question from the audience. This comes from Rahashi Sengupta Mothi. The question says, with respect to paid care work, we know that owing the increased participation of women in the labor market, a large amount of paid care work is provided by women from the Global South and Latin America. So the question, how would this be affected by the stricter immigration laws? Maybe this question can be addressed by Tony, Elizabeth, and Alejo. So please, Tony Payan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. Very interesting conversation. I've been listening to a lot of the points of view. I have sort of anecdotal knowledge of this because I haven't done any particular studies on the on child care. But we do know that the schools in the United States are having a very difficult time returning to classes. And we know the experiences, the very few experiences that have already occurred of students returning to classes in Georgia and other places show us that kids become infected by the coronavirus very quickly. And some of them, though they're less vulnerable, become sick. And then they infect teachers and staff and on and on. So the United States is struggling with this, and many parents are struggling and responding by creating something that is known as pandemic pods. The pandemic pods consist of a number of parents who commit to a set of measures that they can take to isolate themselves in a kind of a bubble, and then hire a teacher, who's usually a woman, to teach their kids on a daily basis at home, not in the classroom, so that they can keep up with the curriculum. So this is a problem. I don't foresee, though, that this is something that is going to significantly shift the labor market for women who provide healthcare, care services, child care services, or schooling. There are many, many teachers available today, and instead of working in the schools, they're now working privately in homes, teaching the kids of the wealthy. The problem is going to be for the parents who cannot afford care, because many of these daycare centers are closed and the schools are closed, and kids are home, and so it is making work more difficult. So what we have to look at is not necessarily how it affects the work of immigrant women, but how it affects the work of women in general who are already in the country, whether legally or illegally. And I think that's a really good research question for us to look into the future. But we do know that they're being affected quite a bit by the situation in the schools. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tony. Elizabeth, please.
Yes, I will say that in my case, I do not have specific statistics about the participation of women in these specific areas because it's not my research area, but I totally agree with Tony. I think that even though some of the restrictions in terms of migration policies have been less hard with healthcare workers and also with workers, including women who are in charge of child care, even if the restrictions have been less hard, a number of factors, suggests that the problem will continue in the near future, not just for these workers, but for the people, even native people from the US who depend on the services of these people due to the difficult economic situation. And of course, currently due to the COVID-19 pandemic, I will say that not just in United States, but from a global perspective, a number of factors suggest that observed gradual exits from lockdowns in most affected countries will not lead to a quick return to, let's say, business as usual in terms of migration management. For example, I'm thinking that backlogs may appear in the processing of visa applications for most categories of migration, immigrants and non-immigrants. Pending work authorizations may become ineligible due to changes in the labor market situation, either because the employers no longer needs the worker or because a weaker post-pandemic labor market leads to more restrictions on recruitment from abroad, including women in this recruitment. So what I see is that, for example, in the specific case of high-skilled potential migrants, they may reconsider their options and cancel or delay their migration projects. And similarly, firms, companies may be less inclined to sponsor intra-corporate transfers and international placements. So the longer-term impacts on immigrant policy, I think that it seems to be heading towards more regulation of mobility and social inclusion in general, not just in the United States. Unfortunately, with economies reeling, many will also conclude that it is time to stop immigrants from competing with natives for scarce jobs. But on the other hand, we still need to consider, even with the pandemic taking place, that on a general basis, we have a talent shortage in many of the advanced economies, not just the United States, but also in many European countries. So maybe the talent shortage may counterbalance this negative situation.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Professor Alejo.
Yeah, thank you. Please let me leave this question because I do not work about labor market or childcare, so I don't know something interesting to say. So I will leave this question to somebody or I want to say something else because I don't have much to say. Thank you.
We only have like 3 minutes to close the session. I wonder if many of you are really thinking that we are in the threshold of a different immigration global scenario. So does that mean that we are renouncing to accept that migrants are agents for development? It is really striking for me to recognize that discussion with some exemptions, for example, in the case of Monica Berea, were basically raised over the issue of migrants and labor, but we didn't discuss what is happening to human displacement and refugees and asylum seekers, which is a humanitarian issue that needs to be thought in terms of the future of multilateralism. So I don't know if someone, we have 7 minutes. If someone from anyone from the panelists would like to say something in this regard, and also a question from Weili that is asking. She wonders how the geopolitical tensions between India and China would impact the lives and work of Indian professionals in China. Many big questions at the end of the session, but give it a try, please. Who would like to jump in?
Well, I'm tempted to stick my neck out to to respond to Wiley's very tempting and challenging question. I think the relationship between India and China has been a long-term relationship. Chow En-lai and Prime Minister Nehru had started this relationship long ago in terms of 5 principles of world peace in Bandung conference in Indonesia. But I think, and there were these concepts of, they used to be called Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai, means Indians and Chinese are brothers in arms. And all those things have been, at times, their history is full of examples where there have been, examples of trust, breach of trust, from which side, it's difficult to say how it starts, but I think it's the world body, it's the global other powers that need to come in to interfere, to intervene whenever there are tensions. And these tensions can be, created by one side, but they need to be resolved and addressed. And the answer is not to escalate the tension, because that is very risky for the entire humanity. The kind of weapons that the countries possess now, if these weapons are put to use, then the humanity is going to be either wiped off completely or disabled in such a way that it would evoke the memories of the Second World War, when the Hiroshima, Nagasaki, we still, have those the remnants of those memories there. So from that point of view, I would say that these are unfortunate developments, and particularly at times of COVID-19, where politics drives the which way that these negotiations will go, and whether it's a meeting ground or it's further divergence. And it's not one issue which is at this, because other countries which are which also play a big role. There is tension between United States and China, and if India and China are friendly countries, then that can also influence India-China relationship. So I think it is a multidimensional issue which cannot be addressed just like that and find a solution, but public opinion matters. That is very important.
Thank you very much, Binod. So time, it seems to come to an end. It has been an amazing journey traveling through all these ideas. We have a lot of homework to do in order to rethink ourselves in terms of what the prospective scenarios on migration will be in Mexico, India, and the United States. Congratulations to the 6 panelists that participated. Thank you to the audience. And let me turn the floor to Monica Bisk. She's going to close this session. And so it was a pleasure being with all of you.
Thank you, Professor Silvia Nunez. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the GRFDT, I am Monica Bishtaranjan, delighted to give a vote of thanks. It is challenging for me to express sincere thanks in a few words, but I take this opportunity to give wholehearted thanks to Mr. Cyrus Mehta, Professor Monica Berea, Professor Binod Khadaria, Professor Tony Payan, Professor Elizabeth Salamanca, and Professor Antonio Alejo for this insightful discussion today. Respected speakers, your knowledge and ideas have enlightened us and have enriched the dynamics of today's discussion on the USA policies on migration. It was a great experience of listening to our esteemed panel speakers today, and we have indeed learned several dimensions of the consequences of changing immigration policies of the USA, which are affecting the migrants during the current phase of COVID-19 pandemic, and will also influence the migration trend after this pandemic at the global level. Thank you all for this exciting and informative panel discussion. It is my privilege to thank Professor Silvia Nunez for moderating this panel discussion in a so organized, timely, and effective manner. I must appreciate it and give you best wishes from the GRFDT team. I also like to thank all the participants, especially Professor Y. Lee, Professor Brij Maharaj, Professor C.S. Bhatt, Dr. Raj Bordile, and Professor Mohan K. Gautam for your illustrated presence in this webinar. My apologies if I have mentioned any of your names incorrectly. I extend my wholehearted thanks to all the researchers and students from India and abroad who have participated in our webinar today. And many of you have been participating since the beginning of our webinar series. We are pleased to receive your supportive messages, encouraging responses. So words are few, but emotions are heartfelt. Last but not least, I extend my thanks to the organizers, especially the supportive team, for their regular assistance, communication, and providing timely information in several social media platforms. Now, let me inform you about our next virtual panel discussion. The tentative title of our next virtual panel discussion is Student Migration During Pandemic Time. It will be hosted at 8 p.m. At Indian time and 10 p.m. at Mexico time via the Zoom platform. And the details will be circulated to you in a couple of days. We request you to kindly join us again and participate in our next panel discussion via the Zoom platform. And please follow us on Twitter to know the updates from our side. Also, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Details are available at www.grfdt.com. So with this note, I close this webinar here. Goodbye. Have a lovely day.
Thank you, Professor Camelia, Professor Kadria.
Congratulations.
Very well done, madam.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Yes. Great to meet Sylvia again and others.